So, how can climate change scientists engage in policy advocacy and preserve their credibility and independence? Basically, how do you as a scientist speak to non-scientists without the fear that they're going to say, you're politically motivated? Everything that you say is just because of your political opinion. This was something that I was particularly interested in because I did my original scientific training in environmental science at UEA, and I was there when ClimateGate happened, and all of the climate skeptics were accusing the whole of climate science as being a big political motivation, that it's not true. And from that experience there, I became very interested in the communication of science. And so that's when I've done the rest of my research, and in my work after my research, I've looked at this intersection between science and society. How do scientists communicate their science so that it is useful for society to use without threatening the credibility of science? Or how do you, as a scientist and a citizen, you have your own things that you care about, how do you speak out about that, about the things you care about, without risking your future career prospects? These are things that I was very interested in. So I'm very passionate that we should take action on climate change, but I also didn't want to risk my scientific credibility. So I tried to find answers, and the only way I could do that was to do a PhD in it. So today, I will cover off very quickly the three main areas that my thesis covered. It was a very practical thesis. So I did all of my theory and reading through the literature, but then I went and spoke to 47 climate scientists in the UK and the US, mainly because the US politically is very different to the UK politically and how scientists are involved, to make sure that what I was finding in the theory matched up with what scientists actually experience. And then in my conversations with scientists, I got lots of beautiful stories about the engagements that they have done, things that they have found have worked, things that they've found that have not worked. So we've got some practical tips and tricks there. But this is all around making sure that your communications suit you. So the first thing is about what is it that we're worried about when scientists engage in any form of public communication. The word advocacy keeps coming up. In a moment, I will help pick apart what it is we maybe mean about advocacy. But first, let's just talk about why some people think advocacy is a problem for scientists. Now, you may have experienced in your community some people, some of your fellow scientists that are very comfortable doing things like this. They're very comfortable protesting. And some of you might not be comfortable. I am not in this presentation going to tell you whether this is right or wrong, or whether you should be doing this or shouldn't be doing this. I want to be clear from the beginning. This is always your choice, and you do have a choice to do these things. What I am going to cover are things that will help you think through that decision for yourself and how it is you want to communicate, so that you can be confident in whatever form of communication you choose to do or not do. But here is our scientific knowledge. We love it. We prize it. Yeah, it's like a trophy. And the reason why we value scientific knowledge is that it's deemed to be trustworthy and credible, and regardless of your political opinion, scientific knowledge remains true whether you're liberal or a conservative. Yeah, it's scientific. It applies to everybody. You don't need to be a particular way for it to be truth. That's why we value scientific knowledge and why it's useful. Therefore, what is it about advocacy that we're concerned about? Well, in my research, I found two main arguments that would make us worried about scientists engaging advocacy. The first one is biased science. This is when scientists advocate that maybe they're secretly pushing a political agenda, or they're creating deliberate tweaks and things in their science to give evidence to a particular policy or particular politics. We've seen examples of this in history, and such as in Nazi science, and this is not science. Yeah, this is pseudoscience. This is not what we would call science, and we do not want biased science. That's not what we value. The other argument that we also see that scientists were particularly concerned about was that engaging in advocacy is an abuse of authority. And this is, as a scientist, you have access to particular expert knowledge, and that gives you a particular value in society. People will come to you to find out details about things they don't understand. That gives you like an elevated platform, but only in the areas that you're an expert in. If you are an expert in cloud formation, and people come to you and you start talking about how you should look after the homeless or migrants, it's not immediately clear that that has any relation to your area of expertise. So that's quite clear that that's not in your expertise. That might not be an abuse of authority. But say you're a cloud scientist and you start talking about sea level rise. For non-experts, they might think that those areas are quite closely related and that you are also an expert on sea level rise. Technically, you're not. So this is all about experts speaking out on areas that they're not quite expert in, and maybe pushing a political agenda there as well. It could be also that you are not engaging in biased science and you are not abusing your authority. You're doing something else in your public communications, but you might still experience the accusation from others that you are engaging in advocacy because they've perceived you to be. The classic case is that just merely saying that you're a climate scientist in some places in America, people will say that you're a biased scientist, which isn't true. But so this is also showing that it's not just if you do these things, it's about how people perceive you to be doing things. That's the key message. And that is one of the key points in my thesis, is about how people see you. So my thesis wanted to explore, is there a way of actually engaging in policy advocacy, in you advocating for action to the governments or for particular policy measures that maintains your science, that keeps people trusting in you and seeing that your science is credible? Spoiler, the answer is yes, there is. You can read the thesis to find out exactly how. But today I'm going to cover a little bit more about those tensions to help you work out for yourself what advocacy, acceptable advocacy might look like for you. But also, even if you're not looking to engage in advocacy, the lessons that we learn from this can help you make sure that people perceive you as not engaging in advocacy, if that is what your aim is. So I'm going to cover off quickly a little bit more about what we mean by biased science and abuse of authority. I am not going to put you through the same pain that I had in the first year of my thesis when I had to read a lot on the philosophy of science. It blew my mind and I unlearned lots of things from my scientific training. But some people say that science is value-free. And that's the reason why you wouldn't engage in advocacy or do lots of other things. That argument that science is value-free is philosophically just incorrect. We do have values in science. Indeed, we have values to tell us what good science is, such as these given in color here. What we do object to and what results in biased science is the presence of political values playing what we call a direct role in how scientists analyze and draw conclusions from their research. I won't go into more detail of that here right now. If you want more detail on that, then we can go through that pain together. But just know what the main problem is, that we don't want political values playing a direct role. The main way that scientists avoid having that happen, having political values direct role, is in the scientific method. And having peer review, having a method laid out, helps other people to come in and examine what it is you're doing. So the scientific method is what we use to guard against bias science. It works to an extent. Again, we can talk about the philosophy behind that, but this is how we guard against that. Abuse of authority. So as I explained, scientists have a particular expert position in society, and the fear is that they abuse that in some way. But we do expect, society on the whole does expect scientists to communicate. For you to just create your science in a vacuum and for it to not be accessible at all, this would include, never publishing papers or only making papers available to other scientists. That's not useful information. So we value some form of science communication, and also scientists feel for themselves that they do already engage in types of advocacy. And this is in the second paragraph highlighted here: advocacy in defense of science. So if somebody's taking your science and using it incorrectly, scientists feel they have a duty to speak up and defend themselves. You advocate for scientific funding. You advocate for that postdoc place, right? You advocate for yourself to have that. You might even advocate for funding for particular areas of research. So that form of advocacy is acceptable. And for the role of science in policy making, if you see that decisions are being made with out-of-date data and you've got more up-to-date stuff, this is something you might push and advocate for. So again, the main thing is we're quite uncertain and object to scientists speaking up but secretly. This form of stealth advocacy, some people might have read Roger Pilkey Jr.'s book on The Honest Broker, where he describes stealth advocacy. It's basically scientists trying to sneak in their own political opinions into the communications that they have when it's outside of their expertise. So here's a quick summary of those two. But as I've said, engaging in advocacy doesn't necessarily mean that you have created bias science or an abusive policy. Right? What you can think of a way that you might advocate for policy change that doesn't result in either of these. So I said I'd describe what it is I mean by advocacy. There are so many different definitions out there. I'm just going to tell you how I define it, and then I'm going to show you what I call my advocacy spectrum, which is a new take on scientific communication and thinking about the different ways in which you can engage. So I define advocacy as an active plea in support of something in order that others may be persuaded to act. It's different from just lending support. It's not just liking something on Instagram, and it's also not manipulation. It's not trying to hide something from people, and they're slightly different forms. The key here is that it's a plea and it's about persuasion. So in the literature, advocacy or engaging in advocacy is often presented as a binary. You either do it or you don't. I disagree with that, because as mentioned previously, I could be trying to not engage in advocacy, but my audience might perceive me to be. So which one is it in that case? I don't think I am, but other people think I am. So the dualism there doesn't work. And again, it's not that advocacy is wrong and not engaging in advocacy is right, because as already covered, there are some forms of advocacy, such as for funding, that you think is okay to engage in. So others in the literature have described informative advocacy and prescriptive advocacy. And the main difference between these is that informative advocacy seeks to just speak out on the facts. So defense of science would fall into this one. Whereas prescriptive advocacy, what they mean by this is you're trying to tell, say, policymakers exactly what it is they should do, what policy they should have. So you're going a bit beyond saying, please do something, which is informative advocacy, and you must do X, Y, Z, which is prescriptive advocacy. They would present it not as a binary, but as 3 different ways then. And again, for me, that doesn't quite work. I mean, what I don't like is in this way of thinking about it, we've got very clear boundaries here, you know, blue, green, red. Again, audience perception makes those boundaries fuzzy. What if some of your message is informative, other parts of it are prescriptive? Then there may be some types of prescriptive advocacy that we feel comfortable with, and others that we feel are not okay, that are maybe an abuse of expertise. For example, if you're a cloud scientist, again, maybe you're speaking out on climate economic policy. So it's kind of related to your work in that it's climate, but then it's economic policy. You're not an economist. So how does that fit in? So here's my go at it. And this is my advocacy spectrum that I made as a result from the theory, but also speaking with scientists. And I showed them it and tested it out with them. I've got 4 main areas. And as you can see, by having them in this sphere, they all have boundaries with each other. And all those boundaries are blurred. There's maybe different amounts of blurring. But let's start with this one, non-engagement with policy. This is just you communicate your findings, you know, without any relevance to policies. This is your cold, hard science. Maybe you're just producing your policy, your papers, nothing about policy in there, just pure, what some people would call pure science communication, pure psychon. Policy advice, the IPCC would maybe plonk themselves here. So providing advice upon request about policies, but you're not saying what should be done at all. And then we have action advocacy and specific policy advocacy. Now, I differentiate between these as being action advocacy as saying, please, for the love of God, do something, but I'm not going to tell you what. And specific policy advocacy is saying, please do X, Y, Z. Yeah, so it's narrowing it down. It's maybe having other values at play there, but either way, they are not merely dispensing scientific knowledge or relevant scientific knowledge. They're also asking for and pushing for some type of action. And the boundaries between these have a different amount of blurring. And what I mean by blurring is that the experience from speaking to scientists is that sometimes it's easier to tell what a scientist is trying to do than other ones. So it's fairly clear cut when a scientist is just trying to do this blue one, is just trying to communicate to you their science. It might be a little bit more difficult to tell the difference between action advocacy and specific policy advocacy, depending on your own expertise as an audience receiving this message. So that's why that's got the most blurred boundary. These boundaries are really important because, as I said, it's not just about your intention as a communicator, it's about how an audience receive it. So I'll cover that in a moment. So the third and final part, what scientists said about my proposal here and some practical tips that they gave. So as I said, I interviewed 47 climate scientists around the UK and the US, and this was back in 2018. But it was great fun. I interviewed them online and in person, and I'm so grateful for the generous time that they gave me on this. It was really great to hear their experiences and yeah, to get their feedback. And what they said, you can read lots of quotes and things in my thesis. What I did is I transcribed all of our interviews for those of you who may be social scientists interested to know full transcription. I then coded all of the interviews around different subject areas. I had hundreds of nodes that I mapped these on, and that allowed me to identify key themes and to explore the similarities and differences across those themes, and what it is scientists were united on and maybe different on. But I've just chosen a few quotes here to just show you the difference in what it is different scientists wanted to achieve in their communications. So Neil, that's my made up name, his example was they just really wanted to keep their science clean. Okay, they wanted to engage in that blue area, that non-engagement. So that was what they wanted to do. Paula, however, Paula thought there was a duty for scientists to communicate and to make it accessible. So she sensed that there was something more that they wanted to do with their science and to make sure that it's useful for people. Andrea, this example talks about how there's a lot of what they do in their work that really associates with the impacts today, and for them to just sit back and to not say anything about the need for action was difficult, but she didn't want to say exactly what it is. So they said they were really advocating for this is action advocacy, for some form of action. We've got to decide what to do about it. And Simon, he didn't care what people thought, right? He knows it's a problem. He knew what he wanted to do. He was very clear with his list, and he thought it needed to be solved straight away. Oh yeah, thank you. These are all my illustrations. You know, when you get to that point in your PhD thesis when you just don't want to write. So this was my form of procrastination, was to do some drawings. So anyway, I do have illustrations in my thesis. I encourage it. It's a good stress buster. So this is where we would maybe roughly match these characters from their descriptions, right? But in reality, this is what happens. Depending on who the audience is, you may interpret their communications as being somewhere completely different. Maybe you've only caught a snippet of what they have said and you think that they're advocating for widespread policy change. Or maybe you yourself have your own political convictions, like super conservatives in America, and you think the very existence of a climate scientist is a form of advocacy. So what's important to see here is that it's not just about your intention, it's about how the audience perceive you. That sounds quite scary, right? Because how can you possibly control how the audience see you? Well, you can to some extent, is what my research found. So is my scientist on the left-hand side here with her communication. She's got her bow and arrow, and she's aiming to communicate. Hang on with me. I know this is a bit a bit sketch, but she's aiming to sound like she's engaging, she's communicating just non-engagement, say. Yeah, so she's aiming for that blue part on her bullseye there. When she lets go of her communication, so when she speaks or when she produces that paper, it goes out into the world and is influenced by what I call contextual factors. Like the wind blowing her communication, it might then mean that her communication is interpreted as sounding like something else. So while she intended to just communicate her science purely, keep it clean, what actually ended up happening is that the audience heard it as a form of action advocacy. Right? Does that make sense? So that's nothing to do with her intention, but it's these contextual factors have influenced how the audience hear and receive her message. Now, there are different ways in which you, as a scientist, when you're engaging in your communication, can be clear in your communication and make sure that when you're, pulling back and about to deliver your communication, you're like Robin Hood. Yeah, don't know if that translates into French, but you are becoming an expert archer. You are already aware of the conditions that you are speaking into and are able to account and adjust your communications accordingly so they land well. I'll say that again. You are able to take stock of the conditions that you are delivering your communication into and to adjust them in a way that the audience hears them in the way that you intend. this is what good science communication is, and these are what all of the good tips that I've got to share on. I can go into these into more detail, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip on. I basically break down contextual factors into different things that you have greater or lesser control over, but you can have an awareness of. So, for example, the voice, the background, if you're speaking out, what is your background? Are you speaking out as an individual, or are you speaking out as a group? That changes how people hear you. And on the other end, an audience's worldview or context that they're in. So are they politically very conservative, or are they in dire poverty with other immediate things that are impacting them? These are ways in which people will influence the way in which they interpret you. So I'll spend a little bit longer now on these practical tips. So these are all things that can help you manage those contextual factors, that can help you to understand your audience and ensure your communication lands. So remember, I said it's your choice whether you choose to engage in policy advocacy or not. What these tips here will also help you with is, if you are trying to engage in advocacy, it will help you to demonstrate to your audience, look, yes, I am engaging in advocacy, as is my right as a citizen, but look, here's the evidence. I am not engaging in biased science, and I am not abusing my authority, my expertise. I'm engaging in what we would say is acceptable advocacy. Okay. So the first one is to speak out as a group. Now, what my interviewees said about this one is that speaking out as a group, there's often something that unites that group. So, for example, there's one that's a group of scientists that are also mothers. It's very clear what unites them. They're all mothers. But then they also say that as mothers, we really care about the future for our children, and we care about preserving that for them. So the key thing here is that they have also done number 5, stating your values. They've said what it is they care about, which is a form of stating what their political values are. Yeah, I mean, political with a small p. It's what your worldview is, what it is you care about, those sort of values. It's easier sometimes to communicate what these things are, what your values are, when you do it as a group, just practically. It also, if you're an early career scientist, so you're at the beginning of your career, speaking out as a group can also provide you with some cover, rather than people focusing on you and you getting all the attention. Speaking out as an individual is something that, depending on different tenure streams and things like that, might be easier to do and protect yourself from criticism if you're an older, you've got a well-established career. That's the slight generational difference there. Number 2, be aware of how you are seen. If you stand up in your communications and you're always wearing a white lab coat and you're in front of a bit, it sounds very formal, but also be aware of what people think about you. Here we might see some gender differences. We might see some perceptions that different audiences have about age, your background, but it's not just like demographic perception, but it's also be aware of what it is you're stepping into. If there is already an argument going on in the audience that you're seeking to speak to, and you step in and say something without an awareness of the key points of that argument, the audience may see you as taking a particular side. Okay, so that's be aware of how you are seen, and also do your homework. Yeah, you've got to understand your audience, understand what context you're speaking into. Frame uncertainties well. Fantastic resources available on this. On my last slide, I've got some links for you. This is all about translation of science. This is what I get most excited about, and what I've done most in my day job, in helping board executives understand what climate risk means for their business and things like that. as scientists, we love graphs. I love a graph. We understand numbers. We understand phrases like very likely and things like that. Normal people don't. So ways in which to frame uncertainties well often include stories. And there's Climate Outreach is a great charity that help I've worked with them and with IPCC scientists to help them communicate uncertainties to different audiences. So there's lots of advice out there. Again, I've got some links for you about which stories will best engage the audience that you're looking to speak to and help people understand the risk and uncertainty. You know, people like to be optimistic. People hear 80% as being basically 100%, whereas we know every percentage matters, yeah? Now, in order to do all of this, if I were to choose maybe one most important practical tip, I'm going to say it's number 4. Okay, engage in dialogue. There's only one way in which you can be aware of how you are seen or speak out as a group, and you've got to talk to your audience. You've got to listen to them. You've got to understand what concerns them, understand their context. So if this is policymakers, you've got to know what's on their to-do list. You've got to know what their targets are for that year in order for you to really engage with them. Just spieling at them isn't going to engage your audience member. Also, in doing this, you're building relationship with them. And when you go down the pub and you're telling your friends about your concerns about climate, they'll listen to you and they maybe won't be worried that you're doing bioscience because they trust you and they know you. And they also know when you're really upset, or they know when you're angry because they know your voice, they know the tone of your voice. It's that sort of relationship that we need to kind of build that will also help you be understood in the way that you want. State your values, as I've already said, is really clear. That is saying, look, here's what I care about. You can see it really obviously. And then the audience can decide whether you are allowing those values to skew your science or not. You won't be, because you're doing great science. But state your values, say what you care about. It's also a really good way of building your engagement and dialogue. It's a really good way of building those connections, because people will often care about the same things that you do. A good way to guard against the accusation that you are abusing your expertise is to be really clear where your expertise stops. Now, we're not asking the audience to really understand your whole area of expertise, but just say, if you get a media question and they are asking you to comment on an area that you maybe know a little bit about, but you don't feel like you're the expert in it, say that at the beginning. I know that's a really simple, basic thing, but say, I'm not an expert in the area, but because I have done my homework, I know that the consensus of experts in that area is XYZ. Yeah. So just reading the IPCC reports, knowing what the key messages are for food, for security, for different countries, they are summaries that you can rely upon. And then get the communication skills you need. If you're really awful at doing PowerPoint presentations, go find a friend that is better at them. Go get the training that you need. If you need practice doing public speaking, go and get whatever skills you need to do what form of communication you want to do well. So there are some examples of scientists getting together and they're practicing giving presentations that they're going to give to policymakers with each other. And that's useful, but you're talking to other experts. You're talking to your friends who maybe understand already what you're talking about. So go get your family members, practice with them. Again, really basic, but people have said how much that has helped them with it. So are we still here? Just before I finish, these are some further reading and resources that I can recommend. That's the link to my thesis. Don't read all of it. It's really long and it's really boring. You've just had a presentation on it. Job done. This is a toolkit that I co-wrote with Faculty for a Future. And this again is this is co-written with media specialists about different ways in which you can engage with media. Yeah, I can make I can make all my slides available, or send these links through. In fact, I will copy them in the chat during our Q&A so that you've got them for your lunchtime discussions. These are the resources that I was talking about that we did for the IPCC scientists. So again, I interviewed a bunch of, surveyed IPCC scientists about their forms of public communication and what it is they found worked and didn't work. The Uncertainty Handbook, this is a couple of years old now, but some fantastic tips here from social science communicators and psychologists that describe the way in which the public perceive things like percentage points. So that's very helpful. And then finally, this is the academic paper off the back of some of this research and that I wrote with others at Climate Outreach and at the IPCC about local stories and really bringing them out. So I'm going to finish there.